Today, I want to challenge you, to inspire you, to do for the next generation of leaders what perhaps the previous generation, or maybe even the current generation of leaders, has not done for you. And with that, we're going to be looking at an aspect of Christ's ministry today that goes largely overlooked. We have been studying through the book of John. We're going through a series in John, one of the four apostles, or one of the epistles, the Gospels. And John's Gospel is different from the other three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. For one, John records no parables. But John records some of the longer monologues of Jesus. In particularly, he records the prayer of Jesus in Gethsemane that none of the other Gospels records. He records some of the intimate meetings or some of the things that the disciples were privy to that nobody else was. But John's Gospel, just about half of it is spent the last 3 days of Jesus' life. You can see that he's racing to, and then he slows down when it gets to the part of Gethsemane, the Last Supper, Gethsemane, and the crucifixion. Well, we're not there. Today, I have been tasked to do expository message on 2 chapters, John chapter 5 and John chapter 6. If you have your Bibles, would you turn with me there? John chapter 5. Now, of course, it's not going to be possible to do much detailed on 2 chapters, but we are going to look at a part of Christ's ministry, something that when I was studying this, I was gripped and I couldn't go any further than this. I couldn't go much further because of the profound words that Jesus uttered. And again, what we want to do, we're going to be looking at an aspect of Christ's ministry that is often overlooked. And let me say that preface this now by saying, it is our responsibility as church leaders to hand off the church in a better shape than it has been handed to us. What do you say? It is our responsibility to make sure that when the time comes that we have to hand off our responsibility, that we have handed it off in better shape than it was handed to us. John chapter 5, we're going to take an aerial view. John chapter 5 begins with the healing that takes place on the Sabbath at Bethesda. It's a certain pool where a lot of the lame and the invalids and the diseased would come. We don't have time. There's powerful lessons there, but that's not what we're going to dwell on. It's interesting that Jesus led his disciples to perhaps one of the most sad pictures and frightening pictures, because it was a place where all of the diseased and all of those who had infirmity gathered together with the hope that with the stirring of the water that they would go and just perhaps would find healing. And it's interesting that Jesus heals a man who really had not demonstrated any faith or had even asked for healing. But again, we're going to fly right past that. We're going to look at verse 19 of John chapter 5. And what we are going to see here, my friends, I want us to look at this. We get an insight into this beautiful relationship that Jesus has with his Father. John chapter 5, beginning in verse 19. Then answered Jesus, and he said to them, Verily, verily, truly, truly, I say unto you, the Son can do nothing of himself, but what he sees the Father do. For whatsoever things he does, these also does the Son likewise. Question, how much does Jesus do on his own? What had he answered? What did he say? Nothing. He says whatever he sees the Father do, whatever is modeled to him by the Father, that's what Jesus does. And now notice verse 20. This was our memory text for the week. It says, For the Father loves the Son. And this is why I stopped right here. I'm reading through these 2 chapters with the intention of studying and preparing, and I was just halted right here. For the Father loves the Son. You know that Jesus came to earth. You know that Christ, before subjecting himself as a human being, is and was the pre-existing eternal Son of God. Do you believe that? He was in all parts, in all ways equal or one with the Father. Philippians tells us that he was in the same glory, the same way, the same likeness as the Father. But when Christ came to earth and took upon himself humanity, he subjected himself to the Father. So much so that he would not venture or do anything except as had been modeled or done by the Father. And Jesus knew his identity. He could have the courage and the strength to do what he could do because he says, the Father loves the Son. And he goes on to say that, and he shows him how many things? All things that he himself does, and he will show him even greater works than these, that you may marvel. Notice, jump to verse 30. Jesus repeats the same idea. He says, I can of my own self do how much? Nothing. As I hear, I judge, and my judgment is just, because I seek not my own will, but the will of the Father who has sent me. This is incredible, my friends, because Jesus had the power, he had the authority to come and really do as he will as the divine Son of God made flesh. But Jesus subjected himself to that nothing that he would do would be of his own. He would look constantly to his Father, and in those moments of private communion, his Father would somehow enshroud Jesus with his presence through the Spirit, and there just pour into his Son, his mission, his identity. And this is what Jesus carried on with his disciples. I'd like to share with you, as we move through this, there is this statement that says, Ellen White, one of the founders of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, says that God will do the work if we will furnish him the instruments. God will do the work. God simply is expecting of us to furnish him the instruments. And I thought, how comforting. You know, the prosperity, the success, and the outcome really of the church is not my responsibility. I simply yield myself to God, and God makes himself responsible for accomplishing his work. What do you say? I just yield myself what he has given to me. And God will do the work if we will furnish him the instruments. So there's a long dialogue here in John chapter 5, which we're not going to get into. We're going to build on this point where Jesus had said, I can do nothing of myself. The Son can do nothing of himself, but whatsoever he sees the Father do. Because what we're going to see is that Jesus demonstrates the same pattern of discipleship with his own disciples. Now we turn to John chapter 6. The very next chapter, John chapter 6. I want to talk to you this morning about intentional apprenticing. Intentional apprenticing. Mark chapter 3, we're going to start in verse 1 of John 6, but let me read this just for reference. Mark 3 describes the calling that Jesus made to the first apostles. And in verse 13 it says that he went up on a mountainside and he called unto himself those whom he wanted. And they came to him, and he ordained 12 that they should be with him, and that he might send them forth to preach, and to have power to heal sicknesses, and to cast out demons. One of the fascinating things that I had seen here is that when Jesus ordained the 12, he selected them. You understand that when Jesus called Matthew, what was Matthew doing when Jesus came and he called him to follow him? He was sitting at the tax collector booth doing his job as a tax collector, and Christ came and selected Matthew, and he says, follow me. And to the others, the fishermen, he says, leave your nets and follow me. How did Jesus get to the point where he did not have a sign-up sheet for disciples? By the way, I need 12 Here's a sign-up sheet. The first 12, come follow me. Is that what Jesus did? No. Did Jesus call for volunteers? No, Jesus was intentional about selecting those that he was going to pour into his worldview, his vision, and his mission for the church. It's interesting. The Desire of Ages gives us this incredible insight into what led to the selection of the disciples. Jesus chose unlearned fishermen because they had not been schooled in the traditions and erroneous customs of their time. They were men of native ability, and they were, I want you to see these two things. They were what? Humble and teachable. Men whom he could educate for his work. In the common walks of life, she says, there is many a man patiently treading the round of daily toil, unconscious that he possesses powers which, if called into action, would raise him to an equality with the world's most honored men. The only thing that is needed, the touch of a skillful hand to arouse those dormant faculties. I can only imagine myself being among the crowd when Jesus is coming, and Jesus would say, I select you, and I would have been overlooked. I mean, how would you have felt if Jesus had selected and made up his 12, and then he said, okay, thank you, everybody. We'll see you again. I mean, how would you have felt? I would have said, that is not what? Fair. Abraham, we could just take it back there probably. Got it. Wouldn't you have said that? That is not fair, right? But Jesus was not worried about being fair. He was intentional. And he was selecting those. He didn't go to the school of the rabbis of his day. He didn't go to the synagogues to choose those that he would pour into. It says that he looked for those who were humble and who, the other word was teachable. Notice in John chapter 6. Now we look at this story in John chapter 6. You see, my friends, when Jesus selected his 12 and he ordained them, he took them out. And it was in those private meetings that he would pour into them. He ingrained into them his mission, his vision, his worldview. And he was preparing those who would take up the work after he would depart. Jesus began his ministry with succession in mind. Jesus began his ministry with succession in mind. You know what we do? We wait too long. Notice what it says in John chapter 6, beginning in verse 1. John chapter 6. After these things, Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias, and a great multitude followed him because they saw his miracles, which he did on those who were sick. And Jesus went up into a mountain, and there he sat with his disciples. And the Passover, a feast of the Jews, was drawing near. Fascinating. Jesus with his disciples. What we're going to see here is he's going to lead them into a great, powerful lesson. But not before he takes them to the mountainside where he sits with them, and there he would begin to teach. And boy, does this tell me, Jesus would often take his disciples away off on a retreat. You understand that it is biblical for spiritual leaders to go off on retreats to gain renewal and strength. Would you say amen? Absolutely. Jesus did it with his disciples. The pulling away. He would prepare them. And then they would go back into the city, back amongst the crowds, where there they would watch what he did and what he would do. Jesus began his ministry with succession in mind. Now we pick up the story beginning in verse 5. Now when Jesus had lifted up his eyes, he saw a great company come unto him, and he said, Philip, where shall we buy bread that these people may eat? Interesting that Jesus would ask the question, where shall we buy bread? You know, this one story that we're looking at here this morning is the only story that is found in all four Gospels. Many lessons that we can draw from this. We're going to draw one particular one as it relates to how Jesus modeled for his disciples the ministry that he wanted them to do. Verse 7 says, Philip answered, About 200 denarii of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may take a little. So what he's saying is approximately 8 months' wages won't even be enough to feed all these people, Lord. And one of his disciples, verse 8, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "Hey, here is a boy who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. But what are these among so many?" This is all that Jesus needed. The small 5 barley loaves and those 2 small fish, that's it. Remember, God will do the work if we will furnish him what? The instruments. God only needs whatever it is that we have, and he can take that and turn the world upside down. What do you say? Amen. And so now, verse 10, he says, "Have the people sit down." Now there was much grass in this place, so the men sat down in number of about 5,000. It is estimated here that, of course, that not including the women and children, that anywhere from upwards of 15 to 20,000 people have gathered together and are here that are going to be fed by the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. My friends, before we move on with the story here, I want us to see Jesus' strategy for building leaders and disciples. And I ask you today, Atholton Church, what is our strategy for developing leaders? What we see here is Jesus intentionally apprenticing. Now, I want to define the terms. Apprenticing. It means selecting, modeling, and coaching for the purpose of replacing yourself. Apprenticing means selecting, modeling, and coaching for the purpose of replacing yourself. That is to say that Jesus rarely did ministry alone. He rarely did ministry alone. He would often have his disciples with him, watching him, learning, observing, participating. But what's interesting also is not only rarely did Jesus do ministry alone, but he gave his disciples opportunity to do ministry alone while he was still around to debrief. We're talking about intentional apprenticing and the power that it has in a person's life. I want to tell you about Randy. Randy was one of my former deacons in a previous church. Randy was a type of person who, he struggled quite a bit spiritually. He was not often engaged, but he would come a lot. He'd come to church. He'd struggled because of, he had some impairment with his vision that he couldn't drive. He often asked for visits, quite needy. And I would find myself in Randy's apartment quite a bit. I discovered we had something in common because he had portraits of John F. Kennedy all over his apartment. And I liked JFK. And so there was a talking point there. But we would talk often, and Randy would just share his troubles. And I decided one day, whenever an opportunity comes to make a visit, Randy is coming with me. And so one of our members had been in the hospital. I called Randy. "Randy, I need you to come with me." I came by, swung by his house, picked him up, and he came with me to the hospital. We visited the member. Of course, they knew each other, stayed for a little bit, chatted, had a chance to pray, and then we left. Whenever there was another opportunity to visit somebody in the hospital, somebody at home, I would call Randy. Randy would come with me. And then, as we were there praying over the person who was sick, then I asked Randy, would you mind having the word of prayer for Sister so-and-so? And then Randy would pray. What I began to see as this was developing is that Randy's energy and his spiritual vigor began to become more vibrant. Randy began to feel better about his relationship with God. Randy was more engaged as a deacon in church, simply because somebody had invested into him and taken him along on visits, and he had the opportunity to minister for others. Jesus knew the power of apprenticing. He knew that if he was going to be effective as a Messiah, that he was not only going to heal, not only going to preach and teach, but that he would leave those who would be prepared to take up the work after he'd left. Intentional apprenticing. John chapter 6, we pick up the story. After Jesus told the disciples to have the people sit down, it says in verse 11, "And Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed to the disciples, and the disciples to those that were sat down, and likewise of the fish as much as they would." Did you catch that? What did Jesus do as he is intentionally apprenticing these 12? Jesus gave thanks for the bread. I can imagine that when he broke it, 2 halves all of a sudden became the same size loaf. And he would break it again, and those halves again would become the same size loaf. And then he would give it to the disciples, and what were they in turn to do? They were to serve the people. You see, my dear friends, Jesus had already modeled for them, and now he's giving them opportunity and sharing in the task of serving. This is an aspect of Christ's ministry that goes largely overlooked, because what often takes place in the church is that we fulfill our duties, we have responsibilities, and at the end of the term, somebody may turn it in, "Okay, thank you," but there is nobody behind them that they have prepared or brought alongside with them to take that ministry or responsibility over. We simply cash in, and people are left, the next people come in who have no idea about what is expected of them. And the world understands this principle sometimes even far better than the church, of apprenticing people, that it doesn't matter what your responsibility is, that we are pouring into somebody who will come behind us, a few, who we could say, I am giving them everything I know, because someday, somebody will do what you're doing. Someday, somebody will do what you do. Wouldn't it be nice to be there and to see it being done without you at an even better clip? This is what Jesus had done with his disciples. Jesus' strategy for developing leaders is that the intentional apprenticing. He asked questions. He distributed to the disciples the bread. The disciples then would also gather the leftovers. You know that the Apostle Paul understood this concept very well, because he told Timothy, "And what you have heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, entrust this to faithful men who will be able also, or who will be able to teach others also." He understood. He understood. You see, Timothy was that one that Paul had poured himself into. He was that one that he had ingrained into him the mission, ingrained into him all he knew about the apostleship. And now, near the close of his life, because this is the last letter that Paul writes, Paul is telling Timothy, what you have learned of me, what I have taught you, now you need to take that, and it must be handed off to others who will also be able to teach others. Intentional apprenticing. You know, one of the most exciting events at the Olympic Games, and the event that draws an enthusiastic crowd, is the 4x400 meter race. That race has 4 runners, each running 100 meters. So they're a team, 4 runners per team. But what's interesting about that race is because each one is sprinting, but they have to pass off the baton from one runner to the next. So the first runner, when he makes his loop, as he begins to come to the starting point, there is a visual mark on the track that the next runner knows that as soon as he hits that, he's got to take off. And there is a window of time where that first runner must hand off what? The baton to the next runner. And the same thing, and once he catches it, he takes off. And he makes his way around, and the same mark, once that runner comes around and the next one sees it, once it's touched, he begins to run and builds enough that he hands off the baton. And did you know that in the race, in this runners, if the baton is dropped, or if the baton is improperly handed off, or it's not done within that zone, that the team can be disqualified? In the Olympic Games, what about in the church? What about in the things that deal with the stuff of God? That before we move on, that we have handed off the baton to those who are coming behind us. My friends, this is what Jesus modeled in his ministry. But in short, I know the objections because I had them too, and working with people, leaders, there are objections, but I'm not an expert. I'm not an expert. Listen, if you wait until you feel that you're an expert, you will never, ever apprentice. If you feel until you have to know everything before you can teach someone or just show others, you will never, ever do it. And so you are not responsible for knowing everything there is to know about your field or about your ministry. You are not responsible for knowing more than everybody else about your field. But you are responsible for passing along what you know to somebody else. If that is clear, would you say amen? Amen. The second objection that people have is, well, what will I do after they have brought somebody? In any healthy organization, if we have succeeded in bringing somebody to replace us, there will always be a place for you. Our goal as leaders in any capacity, whether in the church or outward, is that we are looking to bring in those who we can pour into all that we know. What I've told people is, listen, all you have to do is empty your cup. Empty your cup. God fills that up, but you just empty your cup. I pastored a small church that had a lot of, the average age was about 58. Wonderful people. Listen, I hope to be 58 one day. But they would often complain, Pastor, where are the kids? Where are our young people? We don't have the youth anymore. The collegiates have left. We don't have young people. And you know what I was thinking as I got to know them and the culture? I thought to myself, it's largely our fault because you never let anybody do anything. Intentional apprenticing. And so now, before we close, I want to give you the practical. Remember your meds. Okay? If you're taking notes, you want to write this down, MEDS. Remember your meds. Jesus' way of bringing up disciples. M, first, model. Model. In other words, you're doing ministry, you're performing something, you have somebody and you say, here's what I do. Here's what I do. Here's what I do. You're modeling for others what you do and whatever responsibility. Here's what I do. E, explain. Here's why I do it. Here's why I do it. Here's why I do it. D, demonstrate for others. Here's how I do it. Here's how I do it. This is how I do it. And S, finally, we share. In other words, you tell a person here, you're going to do it with me, and I'll be here while you do it. Remember your meds. Remember one thing, that as leaders, the greatest contribution you make in this world may not be something you do, but somebody that you've prepared behind you. And parents, this principle may be applicable to us as well, that your greatest contribution to this world as a parent may not be something you do, but somebody you raise. Let us pour into the generation behind us, because somebody, someday, is going to do what you are doing. Wouldn't it be nice to be there to see them do it? I close with this illustration. A friend of mine who was studying to be a lawyer told me about an experience he had sitting on the 8th floor of this building in the office of a federal judge. He was sitting on this leather couch in this large office with 2 interns sitting shoulder to shoulder, each with a notepad, feverishly scribbling. The federal judge was on the phone, on the speaker. He had his back to them. He was looking out the window, sort of pacing back and forth. And without knowing the details, it was a very delicate and high-profile case. There was a stenographer in the room typing. And he was describing, as they were listening, that the judge is asking questions. Who was on the other line? There were 2 attorneys who were taking care of the case. And they were discussing this high-profile case. After the telephone call, he hung up, he turned around, and he said to his intern sitting down, "Okay, what did you learn? What did you learn?" I thought when he shared this, wow, if only the church could grasp this. That instead of sitting over here and we whisper, 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 and over here there are those who are just longing and ready to be prepared to come alongside and to be entrusted. Again, our challenge today is that we would do for the next generation what perhaps the previous generation of leaders or the current generation has not done for us. May we hand off the church in a better shape than it has been handed to us. Is that your desire today? Do you want to be used by God as an instrument to prepare other instruments so that He can do the work? If that is your desire, I'm going to invite you to stand. We're going to sing, "O Master, let me